This is the picture in a very, very nice book that was put out by Time Life, and it shows how well she was thought of. I mean, she was really a great celebrity. Every time she'd go somewhere, the crowds would be huge, partly because of her husband, who pushed the idea of getting publicity for her, but also because she was really a fun person and a great character, and she was really in favor of women's in aviation. And at that time, the early days in aviation, the only women that we know about were either passengers or maybe they started flying on their own. But it was interesting because a couple of women in the air races would enter the air races, and some of the men would sabotage their airplanes so that they were not able to complete the race, thinking that somehow or other, at that point in time, being a pilot was a man's job, not a woman's job. So the early environment for women aviators was very difficult, and overshadowed by the number of men who were flying in those days and who thought that women should not be flying airplanes. Unfortunately, it's very, very true that women who did take up flying did so well that obviously the men got a little angry. Some of them supported women, others did not support women in aviation. In 1783, there was a balloon that had gone aloft in France, and yes, it turned out that the second person in that balloon was a woman. And so you can at least say that in early aviation, a woman did go aloft in a balloon that early in our lives. 1783, that was way, way back when, right? 214 years or so. So women did start appearing that early, but they were just passengers, not pilots. Most of the women pilots began their careers in the United States and not in other countries. And the reason for that is because most of the development of aviation took place in the United States. So Amelia Earhart was one of those people who absolutely loved aviation and loved flying, and she married George Putnam, who was a very wealthy publisher in New York City. And George loved his wife flying anywhere and everywhere, and he did everything he could. He bought airplanes for her. He paid expenses for her. They put their airplane on a ship several times and went to Hawaii so she could fly back from Hawaii to the United States. He did literally everything he could for her. He was her major supporter and sponsor of all her aviation. Once in a while she would win prizes, but it was nowhere near the kind of money that George was able to produce. Money was available. Anytime she wanted something, she got it. And sometimes she got a little bit cranky about it because she just assumed that it was her right to get all that money and put it into aviation. This is a picture of a Lockheed Electra over the Bay Area. Some of you may recognize the bridge that was built between San Francisco and Yerba Buena Island, and then from there out over to Oakland. So that's the Oakland Bay Bridge that she's flying over. I didn't realize that the Bay Bridge had been built that far back. That was a long time ago. That was back in 1932, 33, 34. Okay, so as I was saying before, she loved aviation and piloting in particular, and loved to compete, especially with the men. So you want to make note of that. She was such a supporter of women in aviation that every chance she got to support women in aviation and to compete with the men, she did. Because in many of the air races, she outdid the men. Her husband pushed for publicity, and he got it. And one of the things that she began to do with the publicity and the money was to set long-distance records. and I'm going to be showing you that in a minute. Some of her records are pretty amazing for back in 1932 and 33, 34. I mean, when you think about how far aviation has come today, I have a student I'm going to tell you about one of these days, probably not today. It was my student. I taught him to fly gliders. I taught him to fly powered planes. And then 5 years ago, he flew from Fresno around the world by himself in a single-engine airplane. And I was his dispatcher. I was on the telephone or the satellite phones with him the entire way. It was a scary flight, especially from Japan to Alaska. But that's another story. So after she learned to fly, then she went after flight records, and that was her main concern, is that if she could set records as a woman, it would get the attention of the rest of the world that women could be just as good a pilot as men. So it was important for her to go after those records. Some records, you might argue were not necessarily all that valuable, but the fact is that in some cases she did it as the first person, not necessarily the first woman. And I'll show you that. Here are some of her flight records. I did not list them all, but a couple of them are pretty fascinating when you think about it. First solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean, 1932. And then LA to Newark, New Jersey. It took her 19 hours and 5 minutes to fly that route. Coast to coast, solo, nonstop, LA to Newark. First person to fly from LA to Mexico City. Then when she left Mexico City, instead of going back to LA, she went to Newark. So she set 2 records there, solo, nonstop, Mexico City to Newark and Los Angeles to Mexico City. She was quite the adventurer, quite the adventurer. But what she was doing at the time, she was doing several things, wasn't she? She was proving that women could do it. She was proving that anyone could do it. And then she was proving that the aircraft industry could do it, that they could build airplanes that would fly those long distances where the engine would continue to run, that the airplane wouldn't come apart in the air when they hit strong turbulence from weather. All those things were part of what she was proving while she was doing these record runs. It's interesting because in some books, and you don't have to worry about writing this down, in some books, like the History of Aviation book that I'm going to issue to all of you, in that History of Aviation there are just small little notations about Amelia Earhart, and I don't understand why, because the book is filled with amazing information about the history of aviation. But they only give her a couple of paragraphs, and that's it. But the book I have, the book is called Time Life Books of Aviation. One of the entire 23 volumes, nearly half of it is devoted to Amelia Earhart. And the pictures that you see here that I'm giving you are pictures that I got out of that book. Everybody done with your notes on these slides? Okay. This is the type of this, in fact, is a cutaway view of the airplane she flew. You can't really take any notes about it, but what you want to note is that it's a twin-engine aircraft. That's the first thing, right? Second thing, it's all metal, with certain exceptions. The control surfaces were fabric. You can see the wing construction. It would normally hold a lot of passengers, but in this particular case, they used it for fuel. And you can see where Fred Noonan, the navigator, sat. He sat there in the back, in this area right in here. This was his area. She was doing the flying, and she had no co-pilot. Fred Noonan probably could fly. I'm not sure about that. We're not sure about that, but because he was a Pan Am, he was a pilot from, not a pilot, he was an expert on navigation from Pan American World Airways. So here's the route. Actually, she started in Honolulu. Here's what happened. You don't have to write this down. She started in Oakland. She was going to go west around the world. But what happens, she got to Honolulu, and then she loaded everything in there, and all the fuel, and all the whatever it was she wanted to take with her, mostly fuel, tried to take off in a rainstorm, and crashed. The gear got sheared off, the props got bent, the engine got bent, the wing got bent, and so they wound up having to repair the aircraft here. Then they decided, because all kinds of things had changed at that point in time, they decided they were going to go back this way. So her trip from Honolulu to Oakland was actually the first leg of the round-the-world trip. And even the newspapers were not aware of that, because when they got to Oakland, they then started flying and went to Miami. Everybody thought that the first leg was Oakland to Miami. It wasn't. The first leg was Honolulu to Oakland. Now, as you can see, she wanted to stay around the equator because that would be the longest distance, right? 29,000 miles. And she did as much as she could. She stayed near the equator because the equator runs through here, right? Right about here. My student who went around the world started here, went over here to Newark, went way up here into Canada, flew across Greenland, Iceland, and then down to London, and then from London down to Rome, and then he went down here into India, and he stayed pretty much middle of India, and then he went down through this, Singapore, Bangkok, Thailand, and all the way up, and then he went to the islands of Japan. This was an extremely tough trip for him because he had to fly out into the ocean here. Then he had to fly to these little islands in Alaska. That's a whole other story. That was one of the scariest trips that I've ever seen anybody take. Okay, so that's what she attempted to do. But the big problem, as you can see, is that when she left here, she had to go find this little island. The little island was 2.5 miles in length by 1/2 mile wide. It was nothing more than a spit of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and she had to find it. 29,000 miles, and she was flying a Lockheed Electra, twin engine. As I mentioned, it originally was going to go east to west, but crashed the plane in Hawaii. She needed excellent communication equipment because to be able to find that island in the middle of nowhere. Now, she didn't have to do it by herself because the United States government sent a Coast Guard ship to Howland Island to help give her radio signals so she could home in on the ship, and therefore she'd be able to find the island right next to the ship. Everything was going pretty well after they got the airplane repaired. It was in good condition for flying. Fred Noonan was the navigator. He was an expert navigator. And she got all the way to New Guinea. Everybody knows where New Guinea is. What's the biggest city in New Guinea? Anybody know? Port Moresby? Port Moresby, okay. But from New Guinea to Howland was by far the worst part of the trip. It was the longest part, and it was the scariest part. I want you to note this here. This one's long, this 200-foot trailing wire antenna. I'm going to tell you what happened there. And that antenna was to help her get good signals from the Coast Guard cutter and be able to home in on there and be able to find the island without any problem. Okay, now if you guys are taking notes, some of these things you don't have to write down, right? You don't have to copy the whole thing. I wouldn't ask you a question about whether they needed good equipment or not, so you don't have to do that. I wouldn't probably ask you if the airplane was okay because she got almost all the way around the world and the aircraft was fine. So that's something. I certainly, Fred Noonan is a key figure in this, so you probably want to think about making notation of his name. Everything went okay. You don't have to write that down either because when they got to New Guinea, they got there. And they got there fine. They got there successfully. It was the last hop from New Guinea to Howland Island that was the toughest. And then I'm going to talk about this toughest part of the trip. So in a way, you don't even have to write that down either. I just want to make sure you begin to learn what you have to write down as a note and what you don't have to write down. If it ever gets to the point where I mentioned you probably wouldn't have to write something down and then I had it on the quiz anyway, that's my fault. No matter what you wrote for that answer, you'd get it correct. Right? But I think, a couple things are really important, right? How far it was, 29,000 miles, that's critical. The fact that she's flying a Lockheed Electra is not necessarily critical, and I don't know whether I would put it on the quiz or not, but it's because since then, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation has gone out of business. They were bought by Douglas Aircraft. They got put out of business not too long ago. And actually, I had a hangar at the Burbank Airport when I was a Piper aircraft dealer, and that hangar I had was the one that Amelia Earhart used to prepare her flight from Burbank to some of the places that she flew. So I actually was in that hangar since 1932. The hangar was built in 32, and I was in that hangar for 1977, 78, 79, and 80. I was in there 4 years. Okay, everybody ready to move on? Let's do it. Okay, so here's the mystery. At New Guinea, Lae, L-A-E, Lae, New Guinea, they had 7,000 miles to go. 2,556 miles to a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Howland Island. Again, here's another clue for your note-taking. I probably wouldn't expect you to remember that because it's only important in that it was the longest stretch of the flight over open water. So from that point of view, it's important, but not necessarily that you remember exact. If you wanted to put down 2,550 instead of 2,556, you would certainly get full credit for that. But I'm suggesting that as a note-taker, you may not necessarily want to get involved there. Okay, so she had enough fuel as long as she didn't run into a big headwind. Now, look at this. She was warned. She was warned by the people who, at the beginning of her flight, that she absolutely needed to have that trailing wire antenna because that was going to be the thing that would get her back to Howland Island. It was the most important part of her radio communication and navigation, except she decided to leave it back in Miami. She just didn't like a wire trailing from the back of her airplane. The point there is that she was a little bit arrogant, and you remember what we talked about in the learning presentation? One of the learning presentations was not following directions, right? She simply didn't follow directions. She was directed to have it, and she arrogantly said, "Nah, I'm not going to worry about it." So she violated what I call a basic principle of learning. Okay, so this is what happens, right? She left at 10 a.m. So far, all is going well. The Coast Guard cutter was sitting there off Howland Island. The radio transmission at 2:45 a.m., that kind of a garbled transmission from her, from there to this cutter that was called Itasca. That was the Coast Guard cutter, the ship that sat there at Howland Island. Then 100 miles out, they got a really loud and clear transmission from her that she was 100 miles out. So somehow or other, she was getting there or somewhere. Then at 7:42, gas running low, and that was a crucial issue because at 8:45, they got another call that they were on this line of position. Now, what this is a compass line across the compass line, and she was flying up and down the compass line trying to find the island. the whole world obviously was with her on that flight. The entire world was tuned in to what she was trying to do. So everyone everywhere was just sickened by the idea that she simply couldn't find the island. Lost at sea. So there were no more, at least that we understand, that there were no more acknowledged transmissions. A search began, but they had no idea, no real pinpointing idea where to look, because they weren't sure where she was. Again, because that trailing wire antenna would have helped them locate her position, just as it would have helped her locate their position. So, in the last 10 years or so, the expeditions, people put together millions of dollars to go to these islands in that area and try to examine the islands, see if they can pick anything up. This appears to be the most important island that she probably landed at, Niku Maroro. And it used to be called Gardner Island at the time that she landed, if she did, if not sure, called Gardner Island at the time. Originally, they did find bones a long, long time ago, but apparently the medical procedures to determine whether the bones belonged to a man or a woman, etc., were not very good. But apparently, in April of this year, they came out with a study that said specifically they really believe that those bones would belong to Amelia Earhart. And there was a part of a sole of one of the shoes, a woman's shoe. So the end result of all that is that it likely was that island on which they landed. Obviously, there were probably not much in the way of food, because if you saw those islands, you'd realize that there's a bunch of palm trees and that's it. And sometimes not even palm trees, scrub oak and brush. And then they think that the plane probably landed on or near the beach. And then over a period of years, this was 1937, so that's a long time ago, right? 80 years ago. So by now, that airplane's probably at the bottom of the ocean somewhere near these islands, unless it's been eaten away by the salt water. Okay, that finishes our presentation today. My suggestion is you take a 10-minute break. Come back here in 10 minutes if you need to go to the washroom or something. And the class that was here yesterday are going to go on a tour with John Johnson, who is the head of the flight science program. He's the #1 guy in the flight science program. He's going to go on a tour and see a lot of interesting things are going to be involved in over the rest of this semester. And you guys in the back, yeah, I'll take that. You guys in the back, stick around. We need to go over the syllabus. So you turn all those. Why don't you go ahead and gather them up? One of you. Somebody take the responsibility for gathering them up and bringing them up here. Yes, sir.
You have YouTube channel, so what we
Yes.
missed?
Yes, I'm going to up. I don't have one from yesterday, but I have one from today. So I will make sure that gets put up on my YouTube channel. And it's already listed as my name, and you'll be able to access it.